Welcome to Humans and the Environment, Unit 3, which is about human populations and human population growth's impact on biodiversity. And we've talked a little bit about how human populations impact biodiversity already, but we're going to get deeper into that. Everything that we learned in Unit 2 about population growth in natural populations is going to be applied to the human population now. So all of those rules about exponential population growth and logistic population growth curves and carrying capacities and all of that is going to hold for human populations as well. But we're not going to start with human population growth. First, we're going to talk about impacts on biodiversity. That's going to be how we get started here. And it turns out one of the largest ways in which humans affect global biodiversity is in the way in which we grow food. So the first two videos of this unit are just going to be concerned about human agricultural production, human food production, and the way that we alter landscapes and alter organisms in order to grow food. So, how do humans affect biodiversity? Well, we've discussed a few different mechanisms, but two that we haven't really jumped into is artificial selection and the use of genetic engineering. Both of these are mechanisms for altering the genetic composition of a population to create traits that are more desirable for human usage. Artificial selection is humans deciding which organisms in a population are going to be the ones that breed every generation. So instead of some trait innately giving them an advantage in reproduction, humans are just going to decide which ones are going to be the traits that make them the best breeders by just not allowing the other ones to breed, and only the ones that have the desirable traits for humans are going to be the breeders every generation. So getting bigger and bigger corn every year, or larger carrots, or redder apples, or different temperaments of dogs, different sizes of dogs, different coat colors, whatever conditions we want. Faster horses, larger horses, able to pull carriages with larger weights on them, so you get something like a Clydesdale. We call this artificial selection. It's the same process as natural selection, except that the deciding factor in which traits will be the most successful for reproduction is just which ones are the most beneficial to humans, rather than which ones innately give you a reproductive advantage. And this is a method of genetic manipulation. Artificially selected organisms are genetically modified organisms. We have modified their genomes by selectively breeding them. And since all human crops are selectively bred, wheat has been selectively bred over thousands and thousands of years. Corn has been selectively bred to be the way that it is. All of our fruits have been selectively bred. All of our vegetables have been selectively bred. There is essentially no such thing as a non-GMO crop that is part of our diet. All of our food is GMO. The animals as well. We've selectively bred cows and pigs and chickens over time to be more domesticated, be larger, yield more meat, be more docile, all these kind of things in order to suit human consumption needs. Now, this affects biodiversity because if you're only allowing a certain number of traits, a certain specific set of genes to be the successful reproducers, those organisms that have those traits to be the successful reproducers, and you're not allowing other members of the population to reproduce, then that means that the gene pool, the genetic variation in the gene pool is going to get smaller over time. You're going to have less and less variety as you are crafting the species to be more and more towards the ideal version of that species that you want. As you're getting your corn kernels larger and larger, or you're getting your dog to the perfect shape and behavior and coat color and all that you want, or as you're getting your horse faster or larger, whatever it is, you are going to be narrowing the genetic diversity of that population. So that since genetic diversity is part of overall biodiversity, that affects the biodiversity as well. But artificial selection narrows the genetic diversity of a population because it's effectively inbreeding. You're selecting organisms with the same kinds of traits to breed with each other over and over again, so you are inbreeding species over and over. I think I mentioned in a previous video that purebred dogs is another way to say inbred dog. And just like an inbred population will have certain recessive genetic diseases pop up more and more frequently, like the royal families of Europe are more likely to have hemophilia than the general population. Purebred dogs tend to have more recessive genetic conditions that plague them than, say, a mutt would. Mutts are, on average, everyone's different, but on average, tend to have better health outcomes. Now, I say that artificial selection is a method of genetic modification, and therefore all of our crops and all of our livestock are genetically modified organism. But typically, when someone says GMO, they don't mean an organism that's been artificially selected. They mean one that is a transgenic species, one where we have used some sort of laboratory technique to switch out part of the DNA from one species and implant the gene from another species. This means that we are adding genes to the gene pool that formerly were not there. So this also affects genetic diversity. So here I have a picture of a strawberry fish. Obviously, this is a photoshopped picture, but it is a reference to an actual transgenic organism. One of the problems with growing strawberries is they grow early in the spring, and if you have a sudden frost come through early on, it can really damage your strawberry crop. Not all of them are going to survive. It's bad for business, so if you're a strawberry farmer, that's a concern. And scientists came up with this idea. They realized that there are certain kinds of fish that live in Arctic saltwater. So saltwater has a much lower freezing point than freshwater. It goes below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, below 0 degrees Celsius. And therefore, the water inside these fishes' bodies is below freezing. And yet, it doesn't freeze. And that's interesting, right? The salt concentration of the water inside the fish is lower than the salt water outside. So it should be freezing, but it's not. And the reason why it isn't is because there's an enzyme inside the fish's blood, a protein enzyme, that travels around and it finds ice crystals as they form and it breaks them up. It's like a little Pac-Man traveling around the bloodstream, breaking up ice crystals, like those little pellets that Pac-Man chews on. And since it has all these little enzymes traveling around its blood, breaking up any ice crystals that form, ice never has a chance to really get a foothold. So it prevents the blood from freezing over. And scientists said, well, this enzyme is a protein, and proteins are coded for by a gene in the DNA. You just have one gene in the DNA, and that tells the cells how to make this protein. So if we took that one gene from this kind of fish, and we just put it into the cells of some strawberry plants, and all life on Earth shares the same genetic language. The same DNA bases that are used by your cells are used by plants, by strawberries, by bananas, by fish, by fungus, by bacteria, by viruses. Everything on Earth shares the same genetic language. And the code, the way that language is constructed, codes the same way as well. So if you take a fish gene and you put it into a strawberry plant, it will understand what that gene means. So the strawberry cells will start making that enzyme. And what happened was they got a kind of strawberry that even when the first frost came through, that enzyme prevented the cells from dying. It broke up all the little ice crystals, and they were much more frost resistant, so they were able to get a hardier strawberry crop, and therefore increase the crop yield. Now, a lot of people are freaked out by this kind of thing, right? Oh, you added a gene from another organism to these strawberries. Are they safe to eat? But if there's no reason why you wouldn't eat a fish, and there's no reason why you wouldn't eat a strawberry, well, the only thing that we switched was one bit of DNA from the fish to the strawberry, and there's DNA in both of these organisms, and the enzyme is now in both of these organisms. There's no additional element. So it's just another protein. Your body, if you were to eat this, your body would digest that protein just the same way as it digests any other proteins, just 20 different amino acids strung together in different combinations. And we've done many, many studies on genetically modified organisms. Consuming them is not any more dangerous than consuming non-genetically modified crops. There are concerns about genetically modified organisms, don't get me wrong, but those concerns are economic and ecological in nature, not so much health related in nature. Overwhelmingly, if you look at the peer-reviewed scientific literature of experiments and studies done on this topic, they support the idea that these are safe to eat and no more dangerous than any other fruit or vegetable. Now, I'm going to talk about this idea a little bit more because, as it turns out, a lot of the ways that humans affect biodiversity has to do with the ways in which we grow food. So first of all, talking about the artificial selection of crops, you can get very profound changes in an organism just by selecting which members of that population are going to be successful reproducers and which ones are not. So these vegetables here, kale, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli, kohlrabi, they are all stemmed from the same source population. They are all derivatives of wild mustard. So all that genetic variation came from one population. And you find a member of that population that has these big, broad, crinkly leaves, and you keep breeding members like that together, and eventually, thousands of generations later, you get kale. And you have some members of the population that have their leaves in kind of a more dense cluster that forms like a little ball, and maybe you get bigger and bigger and bigger versions of that, and you get cabbage. But some members are going to have those balls, but they are close to the stem, and they get Brussels sprouts instead. Or you select for the flowers, bigger and bigger clusters of the flowers. They change their color a little bit, and that's where you get broccoli from. Or you select for larger root bulbs, and then you get kohlrabi, the bigger portion of the stem and root structure, and you get that vegetable instead. So you have different portions of the plant, the leaves, the auxiliary buds, the apical bud, the flowers, the stems, and depending on which traits you want to be the largest, you just find the members of that population that already have the largest portion of that structure, and then you breed them together with other members that have a big chunk of that. This is also how natural selection works. It's just that in natural selection, the environment would favor say one organism that happens to have large leaves because maybe that allows you to have more photosynthesis, or another individual who has large flowers because maybe you get better pollination services for that reason, and they would therefore be better reproducers. But in artificial selection, it's because humans are deciding which ones are going to be the better reproducers. So that's how we can affect biodiversity, by limiting the diversity of a population and creating we create these large farmlands where we have just one kind of plant, monocultures of plant, as opposed to the much more diverse population of wild mustard that otherwise might be popping up, along with all the other species that would be competing in a big field. We have just one kind of very specific, low genetic diversity plant, like say kale, growing in a large area of that land. Like I said, GMOs are another big way that we alter genetic diversity. So, although there's a great deal of concern about genetically modified organisms, there's no conclusive evidence that has been found suggesting a negative health effect for consuming these, and they do result in higher crop production. Now, someone could say that there's no conclusive evidence that they're safe, but that's not really how science works. You can't prove that something's safe. You can only look at mountains and mountains of evidence, none of which show any health concerns over decades of having eaten these genetically modified. And it has been a very long time that we've been using these. For example, we use lots and lots of Roundup Ready crops, which is the most common type of genetically modified organism in our agriculture. A Roundup Ready crop is made by the company Monsanto, who also make the herbicide Roundup. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in Roundup. And this makes a lot of sense. So if you are a farmer, you don't like weeds, right? Makes sense? Weeds are going to be stealing nutrients from the soil. They're going to be stealing water from your crops. They are working against your bottom line, your overall goal of higher crop production. So if you could spray an herbicide down, a poison that kills off all of the weeds, that would be great, so that you get rid of the weeds and you just have your crops. The problem is Herbicides are plant poisons, and your crops are also plants. So if you spray lots and lots of herbicides to kill all the weeds, you also are probably going to damage the growth of your crops as well. So Monsanto came up with this solution, which is Roundup Ready crops, a version of corn and sugar beets that is able to metabolize the Roundup poison, glyphosate, much more efficiently, so that you can spray the poison all over your fields, and it'll kill all the weeds, which don't have the correct enzymes for breaking down that herbicide, and your crops will be able to just shrug it off real fast. So they will be resistant to that herbicide. All the weeds will be removed, and that means that you will be able to grow a much larger yield of crops at the end. 95% of sugar beets grown in the United States are genetically modified, and this is where we get most of our sugar from. The sugar that is like table sugar and things like that, sucrose that you find in sugar packets or that you use to bake cakes, is mostly from these genetically modified sugar beets. Corn as well is largely genetically modified. Now, I said that there are issues with genetically modified crops, and there are. If you have these Roundup Ready crops, it encourages farmers to use more herbicides. And if they're spraying lots and lots of herbicides, when it rains, those herbicides will be washed out of the soil and end up through watersheds in aquatic ecosystems downhill, and then that can have environmental consequences. So there are ecological concerns in the overuse of GMOs. There are also economic concerns, because this means that if you want to be competitive as a farmer, you would have to buy a specific kind of GMO from this specific company, as opposed to just being able to use your particular corn that you've always used over and over and over again. Companies could put some sort of there are ways that you could make it so that your corn crop is only viable for one generation or 2 generations, and then it doesn't breed anymore. So you could have a company almost require farmers to have a subscription service if say Monsanto was want to do something like that. And that would be a big economic concern, how much power the company that distributes the seeds would be able to have. Another concern is, are these genes that they're creating trademarkable or copyrightable? So if a pollinator, like some insects or the wind, gets some pollen from one of these Roundup Ready crops into crops from another farmer who is not interested in participating in this, are they committing copyright infringement by using some of the genetics from those other crops on their fields entirely without their intention? Probably not, but then again, copyright law in the United States and trademark and all that is a very confusing landscape. So these are economic and ecological concerns that do stem from genetically modified organisms. None of them have to do with the consumption of the food, but they are problems that we have to think about. Now, lest you think that everything with GMOs is bad, I would like to talk about golden rice, which is another genetically modified crop, but it is designed by and distributed by a nonprofit organization, and it is designed to solve a real-world nutritional issue, which is that in a lot of less developed countries, they have diets which are pretty rich in carbohydrates. They're able to grow things like, for example, rice or sometimes corn and things like that. So they can get a lot of their calories through carbohydrates, sometimes not enough calories, but that's where most of their diet comes from. But things like meat, which would be rich in protein or have a lot of vitamin A available in it, because larger animals will tend to have more vitamin A. If you eat carnivore species, there will be even more vitamin A. That is going to be a lot rarer component of the diet. So there's going to be a lack of iron. There's going to be a lack of vitamin A that can cause blindness, anemia. So these are big concerns. Golden rice is a genetically modified form of rice that includes a lot of these missing nutrients from the diet: iron, vitamin A, there's with every generation that they've come out, there's like different versions of it that have come through over time. They've added more and more nutrients to it. And because they've added beta carotene, which can then be metabolized by your body into vitamin A. Beta carotene is what gives carrots their orangey color. The rice itself turns this nice orangey golden color, so it's referred to as golden rice. So it's a genetically modified crop to produce beta carotene and alleviate vitamin A deficiency, and it can grow in these regions where already the majority of where they're getting their calories is in the form of carbohydrates like rice. So they can grow golden rice and usually get nutrients that they would otherwise get from meats and leafy vegetables, which are difficult to grow in areas where you can't raise a lot of cattle because there's not enough water or there's not enough cropland to support. If you remember from way back when we were talking about energy flow diagrams, trophic structure, you need a lot of space to grow vegetables to then support a small population of herbivores as cattle. So in a lot of these places, they don't have the amount of farm space to support livestock. They only have enough space to get the vegetables in order to be able to support the people. But leafy vegetables require a lot more water, a lot more nutrients. They have to be kind of fresh. They're harder to store than like rice and grains and things like that. So that's where you would get a lot of your vitamin A and sometimes your iron, like spinach has iron in it. So those are not as available. So golden rice solves this problem, and in a way where you're not just shipping foodstuffs to the less developed countries, which then you run into more problems of economics, more problems of transportation, of infrastructure, and of just constantly donating materials. This is something that could be grown in these areas year after year after year after year, using the people that are already there growing the food production. So this is using a genetically modified product in order to solve a real-world nutritional issue. However, in some of these areas, the same fears that you hear about genetically modified products in the United States, the same kind of anxieties that people have just because it's kind of science-y, people have them in these areas as well. So even though this is a crop that could solve a lot of issues of anemia and blindness and other nutritional disorder caused problems in these less developed areas, people will raid farms that are growing golden rice and they will tear out the crops. Not all the time, but it happens from time to time because they are suspicious of what is being grown there. So this is why I personally think that scientific literacy and science communication is very important. It is important that people understand what the real concerns about GMOs are and not focus on the unfounded claims or the unfounded fears about GMOs. Switching gears to discuss meat production, which is another very large way in which we affect the environment. When you think about meat production, raising cattle, you probably think about it in the traditional way. And here's a drawing on an ancient Egyptian tablet here. You can see someone raising cattle. You got a couple of cows here pulling a plow. And this is kind of the traditional way that you think about animal agriculture. They're using these as beasts of burden in order to plow a field. But we've been doing the same kind of farming for thousands of years, right? And in some areas, we still use traditional farming techniques. We still raise sheep in large pastures. We have them grass-fed. Sometimes you see cows out in large fields, able to freely roam and eat grass. And it's kind of the classic family farm picture that you see. But overwhelmingly, that is not where most meat is produced in the United States anymore. What we now use for the majority of meat production are what are called CAFOs, Concentrated Animal Feeding Organizations. And here's what a CAFO looks like. So you can see that it's wall-to-wall cows in these pens, and they're kept shoulder to shoulder. If you look down front here, you can see that they are feeding, and they are all sticking their heads out here, and there's really no room for them to actually be able to move around. And after all, the more cows move around and exercise, the tougher the meat is going to be, and the more they exercise, the more they're going to burn off calories. You're going to lose some of that some of that fat on the cows, and you want the biggest cows possible if you're trying to run a business here. So from an economic standpoint, the more space you make available to the cows, the less money you are going to be able to make. That's one more cow that you could have added, any kind of space that you give them, and it's probably a larger couple of cows that you could have had as well. And in fact, in order to maximize their calorie intake, instead of giving them grass, they're usually fed grains, which they are less equipped to digest. And so what they end up doing is producing a lot of methane gas, which is belched through their mouth out, and it creates a lot of this greenhouse gas, methane, which is emitted into the atmosphere. Methane is a greenhouse gas 25 times more powerful than CO2. So even though it's in the atmosphere in much smaller amounts, every molecule of methane is worth about 24 molecules of CO2. And a lot of the human contribution of methane, in addition to the burning of fossil fuels and natural gas, which is mostly methane, comes from these concentrated animal feeding organizations.